The sun hung lazily in the cloudless sky over Oak Hill Gardens, casting long shadows across the meticulously maintained lawns and winding streets. Officer Thomas Miller sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from his department-issued thermos. It was the kind of peaceful Sunday afternoon that usually meant an uneventful shift in this upscale neighborhood, where the biggest complaints typically involved noise from lawn mowers or kids' birthday parties. Miller had just finished writing up a warning for a teenager who'd rolled through a stop sign when something caught his eye. A sleek, midnight blue luxury sedan cruising down Maple Avenue. The car itself wasn't unusual for this neighborhood, but something about it made Miller straighten in his seat. Maybe it was the way the driver sat perfectly upright, or how the car moved exactly at the speed limit, or perhaps it was just that Miller hadn't seen this particular vehicle in the area before. He pulled out behind the sedan, following at a distance. The driver was doing everything by the book: complete stops, perfect signaling, textbook turns. Miller found himself searching for something, anything, that would justify his growing suspicion. His eyes landed on a license plate frame, a thin silver border that technically violated the state vehicle code, though it was the kind of minor infraction that officers usually ignored. As Miller flipped on his lights, he noticed how the sedan pulled over with precise movements, not too quickly or too slowly, parking a perfect distance from the curb. The driver had clearly been through traffic stops before. Through the tinted windows, Miller could make out the silhouette of someone in what looked like an expensive suit. The dashboard camera recorded the time, 2:47 p.m. As Miller stepped out of his patrol car. He adjusted his belt, a habit from his academy days, and approached the vehicle with his hand resting near his hip. The afternoon heat made his uniform stick to his back, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The closer he got to the car, the more his suspicion grew. The vehicle was immaculate, probably worth more than he made in 2 years. The windows were tinted but within legal limits. Everything about it was perfect. Too perfect, he thought. In his 8 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something about this just didn't feel right. Instead of following standard procedure and asking for license and registration first, Miller made a decision that would soon change the course of many lives. He leaned slightly forward, his shadow falling across the driver's window as it smoothly slid down, revealing a distinguished-looking black man in his 50s wearing a perfectly tailored suit. "Good afternoon," the driver said calmly, his hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where they taught you to put them in driver's education. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Miller's response came out more clipped than he'd intended. "Sir, can you tell me how you came to be driving this vehicle?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. The driver's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. A look Miller would later come to recognize as the calm before a storm. Neither man knew it yet, but this moment, this single question, was about to set in motion events that would ripple through their community and change both their lives forever. At that moment, a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees lining the street, carrying with it the distant sound of children playing in their yards and the faint chime of an ice cream truck somewhere in the neighborhood. The peaceful suburban scene stood in stark contrast to the tension building between the two men, one in a crisp police uniform, the other in an expensive suit, each about to learn powerful lessons about assumptions, dignity, and justice. The driver's question about why he'd been stopped still lingered in the air, but Officer Miller chose to ignore it. Instead, he pressed on with his own line of questioning, his tone growing more assertive with each word. "This is a high-end vehicle, sir. We've had reports of auto theft in the area." He paused, eyes scanning the spotless interior. "I'm going to need you to explain how you came to be in possession of it." The driver's hands hadn't moved from the steering wheel, but his shoulders tensed ever so slightly. A jogger passed by, slowing their pace to watch the scene unfold. In nearby yards, lawn mowers fell silent, and curious faces peered through windows, drawn to the uncommon sight of a police stop in their quiet neighborhood. "Officer," the driver began, his voice steady and measured, carrying the weight of someone who had navigated similar situations before. I believe the proper procedure is to first ask for license and registration. Is there a specific traffic violation you'd like to discuss? Miller's jaw tightened. Something about the driver's composed demeanor and articulate response made him dig his heels in deeper. Step out of the vehicle, sir. His hand moved to rest more prominently on his belt. I don't believe that's necessary, officer. The driver's calm voice carried a subtle edge now. Am I being detained? If so, I'd like to know the reason. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and approaching rain, a stark contrast to the growing tension. More neighbors had emerged onto their porches, phones discreetly raised. The afternoon sun caught Miller's badge, sending sharp reflections across the car's polished surface. Sir, I won't ask again, Miller said, his voice rising slightly. There have been several reports of stolen vehicles matching this description. Your lack of cooperation isn't helping your situation. The driver took a slow, deliberate breath. Officer Miller, he said, reading the name tag clearly visible on the uniform. I'm going to reach for my documentation now. Would you prefer to see my license and registration first, or my bar card? Miller blinked, caught off guard by the mention of a bar card, but quickly recovered. Keep your hands where I can see them. You're being awfully evasive about a simple question. How did you get this car? I purchased it, the driver replied, his patience evident but wearing thin. From the dealership on Windsor Avenue. 2 years ago. I can show you the registration that proves it, along with my license, if you allow me to reach for my wallet. Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds began gathering overhead. The weather seemed to mirror the mounting tension of the situation. More cars had slowed as they passed, creating a small audience for the unfolding scene. Slowly, Miller commanded, his hand still hovering near his weapon. Any sudden movements? The driver nodded, speaking each action before he made it. I'm going to reach into my inner suit pocket with my right hand. The wallet is in there. I'm moving slowly. As he began to move, Miller tensed visibly. Keep your left hand on the wheel. The growing crowd of onlookers held their collective breath. Some had their phones out now, openly recording. The air felt electric with tension, and not just from the approaching storm. The driver's movements were deliberately slow, almost exaggerated, like someone trying not to startle a nervous animal. I'm opening the wallet now, officer. Everything you need to know about me and this vehicle is in here. His voice remained steady, but there was something else in it now. Not fear, not anger, but the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how this situation was about to change. Miller leaned closer to the window, squinting at the wallet as it opened. In that moment, neither man knew that their lives were about to change forever, all because of what was about to emerge from that expensive leather fold. The first fat raindrop hit the windshield with a loud splat, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over the scene. The rain was falling steadily now, creating a soft drumming on the car's roof. The driver continued his careful movements, every action announced with quiet dignity. I'm removing my license now, he said, voice clear and steady. And with it, you'll see my credentials that prove I've lived in this neighborhood for the past 2 decades. Officer Miller's face remained stern, but something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. The growing crowd of onlookers had taken shelter under umbrellas and porch overhangs, but they hadn't left. Their phones continued recording despite the weather, catching every moment of this increasingly tense scene. I'm also a homeowner, the driver continued, his calm voice carrying an edge of authority that seemed to grow with each word. My house is the gray colonial 3 blocks from here, with the rose garden my wife tends every spring. The neighbors you see watching right now, they're not just observers, they're my friends, people I've shared meals with, people whose children I've watched grow up. A particularly loud thunderclap punctuated his words, making several onlookers jump. Miller's hand hadn't moved from his weapon, but his confident stance had begun to waver. The rain ran down his face, but he didn't dare move to wipe it away. "Officer," the driver said, "I'm going to show you something else now. But before I do, I want you to think carefully about your next actions." His fingers moved with deliberate slowness toward another compartment in his wallet. "Everything that's happening right now is being recorded, not just by these phones, but by your own body camera. This moment will be reviewed, analyzed, and judged." The atmosphere grew heavier than the storm clouds above. An elderly couple who had been walking their dog stopped under a nearby tree, the husband whispering something to his wife that made her cover her mouth in recognition. "I've seen this scene play out too many times," the driver continued, his voice taking on a weight that seemed to command attention from everyone within earshot. "But usually, I see it from a different perspective, from behind the bench, wearing a black robe." Miller's eyes widened slightly, but he caught himself, trying to maintain his authoritative posture. The rain continued to fall, but the world seemed to have gone silent except for the driver's voice. "Now, I'm going to show you my judicial badge," the driver announced, his tone leaving no room for dispute. "Not because I believe I need to prove anything to you, but because this situation needs to end before it becomes something neither of us can step back from." As his fingers moved toward the badge, Miller's grip tightened on his weapon. The crowd collectively held its breath. A car alarm chirped in the distance, making everyone flinch. "I want you to understand something, Officer Miller," the driver continued, his words measured and clear. "What's happening right now, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who looks like me who doesn't happen to have a judge's badge in their wallet. It's about your first instinct when you saw me in this car. It's about the assumptions that led you to approach my window with your hand on your weapon instead of asking for my license and registration." The badge emerged slowly from the wallet, its gold surface catching what little sunlight filtered through the storm clouds. Miller's face transformed as recognition set in, his hand finally dropping from his weapon. The watching crowd began to murmur as they realized what was happening. "Now, the driver," the judge said quietly, "would you like to start this interaction over? Or shall we continue this discussion in a more official setting, where we can properly address the broader implications of what's happened here today?" The rain continued to fall, but the tension in the air had shifted. This was no longer a simple traffic stop. It had become a moment of reckoning, a turning point that would echo through the department and the community long after the storm had passed. The judge's calm authority had transformed what could have been a dangerous confrontation into something else entirely. A powerful lesson of prejudice, power, and the possibility of change. The gold judicial badge caught another flash of lightning, its surface gleaming despite the rain. Officer Miller's face had drained of color, his previous confidence evaporating like puddles in summer heat. The crowd of onlookers had grown quieter, but their phones remained steady, capturing every second of this unexpected turn of events. I apologize, Your Honor," Miller stammered, his voice barely audible above the rainfall. "I didn't realize." "That's precisely the point, isn't it?" the judge replied, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar incidents. "You didn't realize. You didn't ask. You made assumptions, and those assumptions could have led to serious consequences." A police supervisor's car pulled up silently, its lights cutting through the rain. Word had traveled fast through the neighborhood channels, and now the situation was drawing official attention. The supervisor, a seasoned officer with graying hair, stepped out into the rain, quickly assessing the scene before him. "Your Honor," the supervisor called out, recognition immediate in his voice. "Is everything all right here?" The judge turned slightly, acknowledging the supervisor while keeping his attention on Miller. "That depends, Lieutenant, on what happens next. Your officer here has given us an excellent opportunity to address some departmental issues I've been concerned about for quite some time." The rain had begun to ease, but the tension in the air remained thick. Miller's body camera continued recording, its small red light a reminder that everything, every word, every gesture, was being documented. "Officer Miller," the judge continued, his tone shifting from confrontational to instructive. "I want you to look around. Look at these people watching. Some of them are my neighbors. Yes, but they're your neighbors too. They're the community you're sworn to protect and serve. What message did your actions today send to them?" Miller's eyes swept across the crowd, seeing them perhaps for the first time, not as spectators, but as members of the community he pledged to serve. He saw elderly couples, young parents holding children's hands, teenagers with phones, all watching this moment of reckoning. "I'd like to see your body cam footage," the judge stated, pulling out a small notepad from his suit pocket. "I'm writing down the date, time, and your badge number. This isn't just about me, Officer Miller. This is about doing better. For everyone." The supervisor had moved closer, his presence adding another layer of officiality to the scene. "We'll have the footage ready for review immediately, Your Honor." "Good," the judge nodded, then turned back to Miller. "You know what the most concerning part of this interaction was, officer. It wasn't that you didn't recognize me. It was that you didn't follow proper procedure with any citizen. Every person, regardless of what they're wearing or what car they're driving, deserves the same professional courtesy and presumption of innocence." A few soft amens and murmurs of agreement came from the watching crowd. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent in the air. A fitting backdrop for what was becoming a moment of potential transformation. "This is going to be a learning opportunity," the judge announced, his voice carrying to everyone present. "Not just for Officer Miller, but for the entire department. Sometimes it takes an incident like this to shine a light on problems we've allowed to persist for too long." The supervisor was already on his radio, no doubt informing higher-ups about the situation. Miller stood straight, his posture now reflecting respect rather than authority. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but their phones had captured everything. This moment would live on, becoming a catalyst for necessary conversations and changes in the community. "Now," the judge said, reaching for his car door, "I believe I have some calls to make. And Officer Miller?" He paused, making sure he had the young officer's full attention. "I expect to see you in my chambers tomorrow morning. We're going to have a longer conversation about what happened here today, and more importantly, what needs to happen next." The next morning dawned bright and clear, but the police department was anything but sunny. The chief of police sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as he watched the body camera footage for the third time. The video had already made its way through social media, racking up thousands of views overnight. Local news vans were parked outside the station, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. "This is exactly what we don't need right now," the chief muttered, clicking pause on the screen where Officer Miller's hand clearly rested on his weapon. The department's public relations officer stood by the window, phone buzzing constantly with media requests. The judge's office called again. His secretary announced from the doorway. "He's requesting all traffic stop data from the past 3 years, broken down by neighborhood and demographics." The chief nodded slowly, knowing this was just the beginning. He'd known the judge professionally for years, had seen him work. This wouldn't be swept under the rug with a simple apology and sensitivity training. The judge was known for turning difficult moments into opportunities for real change. Down the hall, Officer Miller sat alone in the break room, his untouched coffee growing cold. His phone kept lighting up with messages from fellow officers, some supportive, others disappointed. The morning newspaper lay on the table, its headline stark. "Traffic stop raises questions about policing practices." A senior officer, who had trained Miller years ago, stopped in the doorway. "The review board wants to see you at 2, he said quietly. "They've already watched the footage. All of it." He paused, then added, "What were you thinking, kid?" Miller stared into his coffee. "I wasn't thinking," he admitted. "That's the problem, isn't it? I just reacted. Based on..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Based on assumptions," his old trainer finished for him. "The same assumptions we've been warned about, trained about, but somehow keep falling back on. Outside the station, community leaders had begun gathering. They weren't angry protesters with signs, but concerned citizens with folders full of data, statistics, and suggested policy changes. Among them were teachers, business owners, and religious leaders, people invested in their community's future. The judge's clerk arrived at noon, carrying a thick folder. His Honor has reviewed similar cases from the past 5 years, she announced to the chief. He's found a pattern that needs addressing. But he's also found potential solutions. In the afternoon, the department's training officer set up the conference room for an emergency session. The slides on his laptop told a clear story. Traffic stop data, complaint statistics, demographic breakdowns. Numbers that couldn't be ignored, patterns that needed to change. Miller sat through the review board meeting, answering questions honestly. Yes, he had made assumptions. Yes, he had escalated unnecessarily. Yes, he understood now how things could have gone terribly wrong. Officer Miller, one board member asked, "What do you think should happen now?" Miller straightened in his chair. He'd been thinking about this all night. I think we need to do more than just talk about change. We need to be the change. I know I do." By evening, the chief had drafted a new department-wide memo. It wasn't just about additional training or revised procedures. It was about fundamental changes in how they approached their duty to protect and serve. The judge's office had offered to help develop new community engagement programs, starting with regular meetings between officers and neighborhood residents. As the sun set, Miller sat in his car, looking at his badge. Tomorrow, he would face the judge again, this time in his chambers. But tonight, he had some soul-searching to do. His actions had sparked something bigger than himself, a chance for real transformation, not just for him, but for the entire department. On his desk at home lay a letter he'd started writing, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he needed to. It began, "To my community, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you change." The hearing room felt smaller than usual that morning, despite its high ceilings and wooden panels. Every seat was filled. Officers, community leaders, and concerned citizens all waiting in hushed anticipation. The overhead lights cast long shadows across the polished table where Officer Miller sat, his uniform pressed perfectly, his expression a mixture of nervousness and resolution. The judge entered the room quietly, his presence commanding immediate attention without a word. Gone was the well-dressed driver from the traffic stop. Here was a judicial figure in full robes, carrying the weight of the law and community expectations with each measured step. This hearing, the judge began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, isn't just about one traffic stop. It's about patterns we can no longer ignore. He gestured to a stack of folders on his desk. I have here traffic stop data from our district spanning the last 5 years. The numbers tell a story that needs to be heard. A projector hummed to life, displaying charts and graphs on the wall. The judge didn't need to raise his voice. The statistics spoke loudly enough. Disproportionate stop rates, search frequencies, demographic breakdowns. Each slide painted a clearer picture of systemic issues that had gone unchecked for too long. Officer Miller, the judge continued, turning his attention to the young officer. Your actions that day brought these numbers to life. But your honesty since then has given us an opportunity. Would you like to address the room? Miller stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. The room held its breath. He'd practiced this speech countless times, but now, facing his community, the prepared words felt hollow. I could tell you that I was just doing my job, he began, his voice shaking slightly before finding its strength. But that would be avoiding the truth. The truth is, I stopped a car because I made assumptions. I escalated a situation because of biases I didn't want to admit I had. I'm here today not to defend those actions, but to acknowledge them and commit to doing better. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The judge nodded, encouraging him to continue. Yesterday, I spent time looking through old photos from when I first joined the force, Miller continued. I remember the day I took my oath to protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, I forgot who I was protecting and serving. Not just some people, but everyone in our community. The room was silent now, all eyes fixed on the officer who stood vulnerable before them. In the back, his old training officer nodded slightly, pride mixing with sadness on his weathered face. What happened that day could have ended very differently, the judge said, standing up. Instead, we have an opportunity to create real change. Officer Miller, this board has reviewed your record, the incident footage, and your actions since that day. We've also received letters from community members, some of whom are present today. He lifted a paper from his desk. This letter particularly caught my attention. It's from Mrs. Chen, who runs the corner store on Pine Street. She writes about how you helped her grandson find his lost bike last summer, how you take time to check on her store during your night shifts. She asks us to remember that one moment doesn't define a person, but it can define their future choices. Miller blinked hard, remembering the kind shop owner who always offered him hot tea during cold night shifts. The human connections he'd made, the community he was part of, it all felt more real now than ever. This hearing isn't about punishment, the judge declared. It's about progress. Officer Miller's actions were wrong, but his response to this incident shows promise for real change. And change is what we need, not just from one officer, but from an entire system. The judge turned to address the whole room now, his voice carrying the weight of years of observed injustice and hope for a better future. Today, we're not just addressing a single traffic stop. We're beginning a larger conversation about how we can serve our community better, how we can recognize and correct our biases, and how we can ensure that every citizen is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon traffic stop, and the police department's community room buzzed with activity. Officer Miller stood at the front, not in his usual uniform, but in casual clothes, addressing a group of new police academy recruits. The wall behind him displayed photos of community events, neighborhood meetings, and training sessions. Evidence of real change taking root. When I tell you this story, Miller began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I'm not just sharing my mistake. I'm sharing what I learned about being a better police officer, a better neighbor, and a better human being. The young recruits leaned forward, some taking notes, others nodding in understanding. Through the windows, sunshine spilled across the room, highlighting the diverse faces of the next generation of law enforcement. The judge could have ended my career that day. Miller continued, clicking to a news slide showing statistics from their new community policing program. Instead, he chose to make it mean something more. Thanks to this wisdom, we now have monthly community dialogue sessions, regular bias awareness training, and a mentorship program that pairs officers with local families. In the back of the room, the chief of police stood quietly, watching. The department had undergone significant changes in the past months. Traffic stop complaints had dropped by 60%. Community trust scores were rising. The judge's initiative had sparked a transformation that was becoming a model for other departments across the state. You know what surprised me most? Miller asked the recruits. It wasn't the disciplinary action or the required training hours. It was discovering how many opportunities I'd missed to really know our community. Last week, I had dinner with a family on my beat, the same street where I once made assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. Their teenage son wants to become a police officer, and now I'm helping him prepare for the academy. He paused, letting that sink in. That's what real community policing looks like. It's not just about enforcing laws. It's about building relationships, understanding perspectives, and earning trust. The door opened quietly as the judge himself entered, now a regular visitor to these training sessions. The recruits straightened in their seats, but the judge's warm smile put them at ease. He'd become more than just a figure of authority. He was a mentor, helping shape a new approach to law enforcement. Officer Miller, The judge spoke up from the back. Tell them about the youth program. Miller's face lit up. Right. We started a weekly basketball game. Kids from the neighborhood playing with officers. Last week, we had 20 young people show up. But the real magic happens during the pizza afterwards, when we sit and talk. Really talk. About their lives, their concerns, their dreams. That's when barriers start coming down. He clicked to the next slide, showing a graph of community engagement metrics. These numbers are important, but they're not the whole story. The real change happens in small moments. When an officer takes time to learn a resident's name, when we celebrate a local graduation, when we show up not just for emergencies, but for community celebrations. The judge stepped forward, joining Miller at the front. What Officer Miller demonstrates is that accountability doesn't have to end with punishment. It can lead to transformation. Each of you, he addressed the recruits, has the power to shape how our community sees law enforcement. Use that power wisely. As the session wrapped up, recruits gathered around Miller and the judge, asking questions, sharing thoughts. Through the windows, you could see kids playing in the community garden that officers and residents had planted together last spring. One last thing, Miller said, his voice sincere. That day could have gone very differently. Instead, it became a turning point, not just for me, but for our entire department. Remember, every interaction is an opportunity to either build trust or break it. Choose wisely. Outside, the community continued its daily rhythm. People shopping, walking dogs, heading to work. But something had shifted. Officers walked their beats with a new awareness, greeting residents by name. Community members waved back, stopped to chat. Small changes, perhaps, but like ripples in a pond, they spread far beyond that one rainy afternoon traffic stop, creating waves of positive change that would influence the community for years to come.